Thank you, Sean. So, hello, my name is Gary Davis. All my life, it has been. This is my 19th SIGGRAPH. We've done the math earlier today on my fingers and kind of counted it out. I'm a technical specialist with the Media and Entertainment Group, and my specialty is 3D animation and compositing. And I've been really excited about this new advent of especially the new release 2013 specifically of Smoke. This is a complete new architecture, new price point, complete new entry level for a broader audience. So this isn't the six-figure SGI business that we used to be selling this thing in the past. This is the same price as Max and Maya. And the version that I'm going to be working with, before I get into that, my demo specifically for the next half hour is going to be a little bit of a different Smoke demo. Typically, a Smoke demo is around like chroma keying and tracking and masking and things that were shot in the real world. As I said, I'm a 3D animator and a compositor, and so what I'm going to be doing is focusing very specifically on how Smoke 2013 can augment or really round out a 3D pipeline. As Sean mentioned earlier, this is the version of the software that I'm going to be using today is freely available for download. You can download it tonight and do everything that I'm doing in this exact same version for free. No watermarks, no nothing. You can use this version until the end of December. So it's like a public beta. We're not really calling it that. It's a pre-release trial. So this is free. I encourage you all to check this out and download it. Immediately run to your nearest internet, World Wide Web, and download this. Some of the highlights, I'm not going to handhold you and read everything, so I'll leave, as I talk for a second, I'll just kind of talk over this slide. As I said, I'm going to be highlighting 3D aspects as a 3D artist. And some of the things that I really find interesting about this new release of Smoke 2013 is that it's an integrated nonlinear editing environment and a compositing environment in one package. So whereas in the past you'd be doing shot-based compositing in whatever package you're comfortable with, and then doing the editing in another package, and maybe the audio editing in another package, and touching that up, maybe color grading in another package, all of that can be handled in one environment. And that's one of the really interesting things about Smoke in my book as a 3D artist is 3D is complicated enough as it is. I want to do as little more learning as possible, so I want one environment that I can do this. If you're comfortable with layer-based workflows coming from something like Photoshop or After Effects, you're going to be very at home with Smoke, as well as if you're familiar with something like Nuke or Shake or something like Toxic, which is now Composite, or a node-based environment, you have both workflows, and you can actually merge those two workflows together. Some of the other things, again, I'm not going to go through every one of these, but full FBX import, floating point, OpenEXR file formats fully supported. Also options for doing stereoscopic workflows. So if you're doing anything, whether it's based on real world footage or 3D rendered assets or both, combining the two, you've got a full 3D stereoscopic pipeline. So color correction, this is the Academy Award winning color corrector, the same one as Flame. So on and on we go. So with that, I'll exit out of our full screen player here and sort of introduce you to the new release of Smoke. So it is a new release, brand new interface. We did a lot of work studying what people want to work with and how they kind of work in the past. I have a more traditional 2-up view here that actually Smoke defaults to, and if you're comfortable with something like Avid or Premiere or Final Cut, this is a very comfortable workflow where you have source and record players, indicated by green and red accordingly. I like working in a single typical player here, so it's kind of like what I'm working on is what I see kind of thing. You can change that around a little bit as well, but if I just tap the T key, I'm going to get into the thumbnail view, and I actually have access to what's called the desktop. Now I'm going to be using a lot of the desktop for the way that I work and getting around. Before I get into that, I really want to just play down a final of the shot that I'm going to be, or a couple of shots, lots of shots, about 12 of them. And this is a piece that we had done, Autodesk had contracted by a company called Hatch Studios, and we'd really like to thank them for providing this assets for our demonstration purposes. So I'm going to play this down for 1 minute and let you guys just enjoy this short film called Gwen and Dave. So once again, really huge thanks to Hatch Studios. I can't tell you in the last 2 weeks how this thing came together. Many metal ray render farms in Canada and across the United States were kicking this thing out. And actually, Sean, while you're here, I'd like to thank you for all the help. You wouldn't have been possible without my good friend Sean over here. So one of the things I mentioned, here we are at SIGGRAPH. In my book, it wouldn't be a SIGGRAPH demo without a teapot. Whether it's, I'm a 3ds Max guy, so we all get our kicks out of the teapot. And this is certainly not the most breathtaking animation that I've ever rendered right here, but I wanted to point out a couple of things about this. This is a model that I made actually this morning. It was just kind of laying in bed, and I thought, oh, let's a teapot. I'm missing a teapot, so I'm going to throw the teapot around in here. But what this teapot actually is it's a scene that I exported out of 3ds Max. And this is actually done, and I'm doing this intentionally. I'm going to kind of go right into a big sort of overwhelm you with a little bit of an interface here. I want to introduce you to a concept called Action. And Action is a 3D compositing environment. I mentioned that this is a full-blown compositing application as well as nonlinear editing. And just to kind of, I'm doing this intentionally to kind of just overwhelm you and kind of intentionally. I mentioned that I'm a 3D artist, and this is going to be Smoke for 3D pipelines. Well, this is a kind of a node-based workflow that most 3D artists are workflow. Things like shaders, things like lights, volumetric effects, and these are things that you typically wouldn't consider in a nonlinear editing package. These are very akin to a 3D environment. Well, this is, in fact, a full-blown 3D environment. And you can see I have that real-time occlusion of that lens flare there. So I'm able to do full volumetric lighting. And just to be really clear about this, I'm not playing a video clip right now. I'm orbiting around a full 3D environment. And I have things like not like 3D, but I have the ability to work with, here's my set, for example. I can rotate the set. These are all full 3D geometric layers. They support substance textures, if you're familiar with those with things like from 3ds Max or Maya. I also have things like the ability to cast shadows. So I intentionally am showing you quite a bit off the bat here, but I want you to keep this in mind that everything I'm about to do is taking place potentially with the ability to work in a full 3D environment, okay? So as I get back out of there and just play that down one more time, excuse me, exiting it out of this Connect Effects, and I'll be back to that, show you what that is in a second. So once again, if I just show you this again, I didn't do this to be the most breathtaking animation in the world, but this wasn't rendered out of a 3D package. It was modeled in a 3D package, exported as an FBX, and then rendered out of Smoke's Action environment. So just to be clear about that, we've got a full-blown 3D environment inside of our nonlinear editor, okay, just to kind of keep that in mind. So with that, I'll sort of break it back down and start from a little bit slower pace here and introduce you to a little bit more of the interface. So down here at the bottom, obviously, you've got a timeline. And this is sort of our timeline tab down here, which is our main creative environment. I also have a tab over here called the Media Hub, and this is where you kind of bring in media and assets off of your network or hard drives, whether they're the USB drives or full NASs and SANs and all that stuff. It's your facility. So what I can do, I'll show you kind of a typical workflow here. If I just come out here and start browsing my directories, you can see that I've got clips here and I've got some options for this. If I swipe over here, I'm using a Wacom Intuos 5, and I'm using a very gestural process to do a lot of swiping around over here to kind of bring things up and back. If I just select a clip over here, I can optionally see I've got a player over here and kind of see things like what the heck the thing looks like. I also can see interesting metadata like what file format this is, the resolution, the bit depth, things like frames per second, and so on. If this were footage created, captured in the real world, like from Red cameras or something like that, there's a lot of extra metadata in there. But in this case, this is CG rendered assets. It's 1080p, floating point OpenEXRs, and I'm good to go. So I can swipe that out. I want to also show you a couple of different ways that you can bring in assets over here. So if I just come down, I'm going to just import into this empty directory here for my import demo. What I'm going to do is actually focus on just this one clip right here. Now, these were rendered out of 3ds Max using Mental Ray with an alpha channel, okay? So they're RGB and alpha. There's an alpha channel. Pretty typical workflow for compositing. An alpha channel comes in really handy for compositing, in fact. But what I can do inside of Smoke is optionally do this thing called create a multi-channel clip. Now, if I don't do that, and there's no right or wrong to this, I just want to make you aware as a 3D artist that this is a very important aspect to consider. If I don't create a multi-channel clip, and I'm just going to bring in this one clip and tap import, and go out to my creative timeline and go back into thumbnail view. Let's put these over to the side. What I just brought in were these these 2 clips. Now, I remember I brought in 1 clip, it was when I hit import, but it split out the alpha channel as an alpha, what we might call an alpha split. So I have my RGB here and my A, or alpha, over here. And that's one way of working. Some people in compositing environments like to break that out and see the alpha channel and keep the sort of transparency very clearly apart from the RGB processing pipeline. And again, there's nothing right or wrong about that. It's just one way of working. Well, gesturally, I'm just going to throw those away and show you the other way of working, is to say that I'll take, again, that 1 single clip, and I want to create a multi-channel clip for that. By the way, I will point out that it might be hard to read, but it says multi right there, which is indicating this is a multi-channel clip of some kind. In this case, it's just RGB and alpha, but as you'll see in a moment, I can work with full multi-channel OpenEXRs as well. Now back to the action over here. If I do say create a multi-channel clip and go ahead and import that, if I look back on my timeline, it brought in just 1 clip, but it created what's called a container. And this container contains the alpha channel. So this is more akin to a traditional workflow where you're just having the alpha channel kind of ride along with the RGB. And that's how most people kind of work these days. And I don't want to say that that's right or better or anything like that, but it's a lot of people like to split that alpha channel out and kind of work in a procedural processing pipeline with it separate. And this is an option that you can do both. You can have it ride along, or you can separate that out. So just to be clear that that's what's happening. Now, once again, I'm going to throw that away. And in this time, I'm going to bring in all these clips. Now, before I do that, another thing I'm going to do is actually show you some more import options here. Some of them are format specific, under the tab called Format Specific Options, where I can say Show All Options and do things like OpenEXR, or an image sequence. In this case, sometimes I might be rendering out an animation at 720p resolution. Well, video gear, like cameras and things, if you're capturing at 720p, quite often it's at 59.9 frame rate. But I'm rendering 720p animation at 24 frames per second, and Smoke is kind of misreading that. And it's not, and Smoke's not doing anything wrong, but I might want to say, I want to force this frame rate to be 24 frames per second. So as I'm bringing assets in, I want to force a frame rate and say, you know, by golly, I need these things to be a very specific frame rate for my project, and I want to make sure that that's forced. I can also do some metadata things like naming conventions and so on. I could also do some things over here, like change the resolution, up res, down res, or bit depth conversion, and so on. But this is going to be good. I'm going to bring in all these clips. I am going to create a multi-channel clip for all of these and go ahead and say import that. And once again, go back to my timeline, and now you can see that we've got our clips. Over here, these are just ones that I've already done, and I'll kind of, you know, I'll say ignore those for now. We're going to really focus on just these clips that we've got in our workspace or our desktop. Now, I like using this desktop to kind of deal cards around almost like a you know, poker table where you would be dealing cards. And I can start to sort of think about my compositing and my editing for that matter. I could put these things end to end and kind of think in terms of editing. But right now, I just want to think in terms of compositing and say, you know, this background is going to be my bottom layer. I'm going to probably put these 3 together, and that's my backplate. And then I've got these characters over here. Well, they're going to have these ambient occlusion passes, and then here's a specular highlight or a rim light. So there's my sort of a pre-mental comp, if you will. I'm just kind of thinking that aloud and kind of thinking it through. So I can see I've got 6 layers. And I can see that these are, this number here indicates the frame duration. It's 204 frames. Now, before I move on, I'll take it a little bit of an aside and show you another thing. I like, as a 3D artist, I can go into the Smoke preferences, and under the General tab, I can work in either SMPTE timecode, much in the way a editor would think, but as an animator, I typically think in terms of frames. So this is, again, there's no right or wrong to this, but as an animator, I like to work in frame counts. That's how my brain has been wired for my whole life. So I think in frames. I can also work as an artist, 3D artist, who's going to be doing compositing of all these rendered assets and having ambient occlusion and all these things comped up on top of each other. I can opt between a track-based render or a frame-based render. And this will make a little bit more sense in a moment, but while I'm in the preferences, I wanted to point that out, that I am using a frame-based render, which means as it's going to render, you know, if I'm on frame 8, it's going to do all the layers for frame 8 before it moves on to frame 9, as opposed to doing track-based rendering. Again, that's just an aside, some of the preferences that you can set up as a 3D artist that you might want to take advantage of inside of Smoke 2013. So once again, I've said I got 6 layers that I'm going to be creating here. It's 1080p and it's 204 frames. So as opposed to just drag and dropping these things, which I could do down into the timeline, I'm just going to say let's create a new sequence here. So inside of this folder, I want to work organized. I'm going to select that folder, and I'm going to say let's create a new sequence. And I'm going to call this layers or layer demo or whatever, layer demo. And I'm going to have How many video tracks? Well, I said I need 6, so I can pre-do this ahead of time. I'm working in 1080p. I can work in any resolution that I want. Mixed resolutions throughout the application, not a problem. Any bit depth that I want, including floating point. In this case, I'm not going to work with any audio, and that's going to be a pretty good starting point. Let me just double check. 6 tracks. Oh, duration. That's an important factor. So duration there, we want our 204 frames. So let's just dial that up. 204. So we've got our empty sequence, and we can just say create that. And down here at the bottom, as you would expect in the timeline, we've got our empty 6-layer, 204 frame, workspace waiting for us. So now I can just drag and drop and really just quickly say, all right, these layers are going to just start comping up, and I want to just drag and drop these. So again, I mentioned earlier that you can work in a layer-based workflow or a node-based workflow, and I'm going to kind of show you the migration of working from one and switching midway to the other. So really quickly, I'm just going to take my 6 layers, put these up on top of each other, and then let's take a look at this. So one of the things I'm going to do here is introduce you to this thing called the focus. It's this tiny little yellow hashtag right there in my my scrub bar. But you'll notice right now I've got this rim light. If I change the focus, and I'm using the arrow keys to do this, I just hit the down arrow and it took the focus down a layer. It's showing me the end result up to that focus point, okay? So if I go from the bottom, and let me just go full screen so you can really see this. If I go from the bottom, there's our background layer. Here's the foreground of our background, if you will. We're moving forward in time. Here's the ambient occlusion that needs composited. Then we have our characters. Then we have our character ambient occlusion. And lastly, our rim lights. So those are going to be the layers that we're going to be needing, or we've got, but we don't have our transfer modes, right? The blending modes. So the first thing is to get into compositing. We've got these things stacked. Now what I'm going to do is select all those and introduce you to these things. These are timeline effects. So just by hitting this effects button, I get access to several tools, including time warp, resize, text, color corrector, which is the Academy Award-winning color corrector, color warper. It's phenomenal. I'm not going to get into the full color correction, but if that alone is reason not to buy the software, it's a phenomenal color corrector. Spark, which is for third-party plugins. Blending wipe or axis is the one that I'm after, and I'm going to apply an axis effect to every single one of these layers. What axis is almost like a mini 3D action, and you saw me earlier with the teapot rotating around and all that 3D environment. Well, this is like saying axis is like a single layer 3D environment. So I kind of have a little mini 3D environment for every single one of these layers. And that's a lot of overkill for what I'm doing right now. I don't really need it, but you could see here that I could like change the position of a layer, and I could do change rotation and things. That's not what I'm after in this case, though. The reason that I applied that axis effect, first and foremost, is to get access with the axis. How's that for a tongue twister? Get access with the axis to my alpha channel. Say that 10 times fast. So I've got the access to my alpha channel now, and now what I also have access to, and this is, I'll stop, I got to stop, is the blending modes or transfer modes. So if I look at this right here, this is our ambient occlusion, and this is the layer. Again, I'll point out the focus right here. I can just change the transfer mode to multiply, and this is going to do that multiplication of our ambient occlusion over the background. I know I need to do that on our foreground, so I'll just quickly change that to a multiply. And this rim light right here, I'm going to change to a simple additive. Now when I go full screen and I kind of quickly rock through these composites, you can see that my layers, background, midground ambient occlusion, foreground characters, foreground ambient occlusion, and rim light. So now I've got the comp coming up, and it's working in a very sort of editorial and compositing environment in one, okay? Now that's sort of getting it up as layered. Now what I can do, and just as a workflow, something I like to do is collapse down this timeline into what's called the thumbnail view. And this is just a housekeeping thing that I've learned. You don't have to do this, but I'm just going to hold down the F key and copy this out. And I'm going to make a duplicate of that. Now that didn't create duplicate media or anything like that. It just is sort of like a backup. And because what I'm about to do is actually enter and do the switch from working in a layer-based environment to a node-based environment. And in case I want to go back, you could maybe, I mean, you can always undo and that kind of thing. It certainly supports multiple undos, but I might just want to keep a layer-based version around just for whatever reason. I just want to show you that you can do that sort of copy and make a quick backup, or a version, if you will. Versioning is also a very nice aspect of that. So I just made a quick backup. Now, once again, I'll come back through, select all these layers. Excuse me, let me make sure I've got, yep, I got all 6 layers selected. And then what I'm going to do, instead of applying an effect at the timeline level, I'm going to go into what's probably the most powerful feature in the new release of Smoke, called Connect Effects. And Connect Effects is going to do a whole lot of work for me just by clicking that one button. It's taking all those layers, all those axis effects, all those blending modes, and all those layer orders and transfer modes and all that good stuff, and it's now bringing me into a node-based compositing environment. So this is, again, more options for people that are doing that node-based workflow or want and desire that node-based workflow. Now, this node that was created is a thing called Action. And this Action node is the full 3D environment that you saw me orbiting around with the teapot and having all those volumetric lights. So it's a really powerful node, but it's one of many nodes. And down here you can see we've got all these different nodes and tools for doing things like stylized flares and glows and color corrections and paint and stabilizing and keying and masking and all that stuff. But I just want to point out that Action is a very powerful 3D compositor, and it's just one node of many, okay? So it's a processing tree where I have all of these things coming together into my shot. And let's just say, for example, I take a color corrector, double-click on my color corrector. If you've ever used the, once again, this is the Academy Award winner right here, this color corrector. And I could just color correct all those layers, and you can see that all these layers are coming together into that single node. And then downstream, I'm just color correcting. And then this is the output node. The output node is what gets sent back out to our timeline. Okay, so whatever ends up, that's kind of the end result. That gives me the ability to go back to my timeline. And I'll show you, if I just exit back out of Connect Effects, I'm going back into my editorial. So I'm kind of exiting my compositing brain and flipping back into my nonlinear editing brain without exiting the package. And here you can see I've got that clip all sort of nested down. It's not flattened in any stretch of the imagination. It's all nested down into this single clip. And what that gives me the ability to do is then work with multiple clips in doing something like this. So here's an assembly of all these different clips and all these different shots, right? And I'm, pretty straightforward nonlinear editing stuff. But every single one of these, and I've used Smoke for a little while now, so my eye is kind of trained to look at this color blue. This color blue of these clips represents a contained element. So that means there's a lot of stuff going on inside of that segment right there. And let's take this one for example. This clip right here, if I look at that focus again at the bottom clip, it's our finished comp of our character, and she's having a problem with the wrench. If I look at this clip above it, it's got sort of these volumetric rays coming through, okay? Well, what I've done here is just very quickly F-copied and just made a duplicate of this or another version of that shot. And the top one has these raise effects. So again, I got this bottom one. I don't want to do a destructive process here. So I'll just make a quick backup and work very much like nonlinear editors would, because this is a nonlinear editor, and go into this one here. Well, this clip right here, if I go into the Connect Effects editor, you can see that I've got all those nodes set up ahead of time. And inside of Action, so and to be clear about what I'm about to do, we're at the schematic view of Connect Effects. So we're looking at this procedural compositing environment. And just to remind you, this is a very powerful single node right here. What I can do, because this is a full 3D compositing environment in that single node, is go into a Action schematic, which is a schematic view of all the contents that are happening inside of that one node. Because again, if you're coming from 3D, 3ds Max, Maya, Softimage, or whatever, you're probably used to things like lighting, volumetric rays, shaders, polygons, and all that stuff that might be intimidating to people that aren't from 3D. But if you're moving from 2D to 3D, this is a really nice option. Or if you're already doing 3D renderings, this is very comfortable workflow because it's this environment that you're used to. And just to prove I'm not lying, I could do things like take this light right here and just kind of position it around. So you can see that I'm doing this volumetric effect. This is not a plugin, by the way. I'm not using any plugins. This is all native to the application. And then just to remind you that I am, in fact, in a full 3D environment. You can see here, I can rotate that around. Now, anybody that's done 3D, things like motion blur, depth of field, volumetric effects, these are very render-intensive things to do in 3D. And with one job, you could very easily justify the cost of Smoke. Just to remind you, the new price, same as Max, same as Maya. It's a completely new interface. With that, I'll kind of close it out. I do want to remind you, and I'll put up a slide here of a URL to write down. I can't reiterate enough how important it is to go check out the free trial. We're running it through the end of December. And so let me just put up let me see if I've got my single slide here. Whoops. With our Smoke free trial. So this is a URL. Write it down. Download Smoke tonight. And make that whole animation, make that 3D environment that I did. So thank you.